Melbourne, 1942, and a woman applies the finishing touches to her look. She's heading out on the town. Amongst the men she might encounter, GIs arriving daily from America. And one of them is a serial killer with a bizarre fetish. He wants to steal the voices of women he meets.
Suddenly, reading the paper in the morning, there would be, alongside news of the latest developments in the war, news of the latest attack upon a woman.
Is it a New Jersey man who's been seen lurking in the shadows near tram and train terminals? Private Eddie Leonski cuts a perplexing figure, often drunk and bizarrely talking in a high-pitched tone.
It was this voice, this softness that he wanted somehow to have, this thing that he kept emulating himself, soothing himself with these voices.
3 women are dead and detectives are sure there will be more victims, unless they can get inside the mind of a serial killer. In 3 May weeks, no woman was safe during the so-called Melbourne Brownouts of 1942.
It created a city of shadows, of frightening corners.
With the lights doused or dimmed to make life hard for Japanese bombers, 3 women had been snatched, stripped, strangled, left for dead. Melbourne was a city at war, but the danger was from a friend at home, not the enemy abroad. Already known for his heavy drinking and sexual abuse of a woman at home in New Jersey, Private Eddie Leonski arrived in Australia at a time when relations between the Allies were not always what the authorities wanted.
More troops for the American Expeditionary Force in Australia. Armed convoys winning the game of hide-and-seek with enemy fleets.
Rumours abounded about GIs running off with the wives of Australian diggers or soldiers. Complaints were common of the Yanks being overpaid, oversexed, and overhere.
To some, the American troops seemed exotic creatures. Hollywood looks and accent, better fed, and certainly better paid. And where were the Aussie boys? Spilling blood on foreign soil, while these Americans were on a cushy posting and not even seeing action.
Certainly when a Melbourne girl went out on the town, it was likely she'd meet a GI. Mrs. Ivy Violet McLeod went out on Saturday, May 2nd. Around 5 o'clock, she went to see a friend with whom she stayed until 8. After that, she headed into the city, where she was seen by witnesses wearing a black dress with a lacy neckline. Ivy knew the area well. She'd worked there as a waitress in a cafe. Court transcripts from the day reveal that by 11 o'clock, Ivy was in the home of an aircraft mechanic that she had known for 7 months called John Patrick Thompson. He knew her as Ivy Darvigal, the maiden name that she'd used when out with him. He didn't know she was married. The couple intended to start a new life in New South Wales. As they made plans, dreamed of a new life, Eddie Leonski tried to forget his.
The appalling things that Leonsky had suffered as a child were all locked up in his psyche, and he was a very troubled man. Not even drink would help him. The one source of comfort to him was his mother, and he was missing her rather badly.
Meanwhile, Leonsky trawled some exotic places, as well as some classic wartime bars where he liked to listen to women singing, and stayed late to do just that.
One of the most interesting features of Eddie Leonski's story is his relationship with the female voice. He himself would sing with a very high-pitched female voice. You gotta imagine this is like a burly American soldier that would emit very, very high-pitched feminine tones. It sounds almost eerie, the idea of him almost trying to self-soothe in that way.
Across the street from where Eddie Leonski was leaving a bar, Ivy was saying goodnight to John Thompson. He offered to walk her to the tram terminus, but she insisted she should go alone. She set off to catch the night tram and reassured John that she'd be fine. There were enough people about for her to cry for help if it was needed.
It looks like from the evidence that Ivy really wasn't worried about walking home on her own. She went off into the wee small hours toward the tram and didn't really want somebody to accompany her. Perhaps it was because she was a married woman and didn't really want to be seen with a man.
As she left the house in the Albert Park area of Melbourne, she may have caught a glimpse of an American GI, obviously drunk, walking away from the Bleak House Hotel. Or perhaps she didn't see him. It was 2:30 a.m. in the Brownout. It wasn't easy to see friend or foe, Australian or American. Her tram was due at 2:45, just 15 minutes to wait for her ride back to East Melbourne. Eddie Leonski approaches her, asks if they can talk. He likes the sound of the voice of a woman.
At some point, she must have become frightened.
She has every reason to be. The mind of the man she's about to encounter is deeply troubled. Private Eddie Leonski was a larger-than-life figure both at Camp Pell in Melbourne's Royal Park and in the town. He was physically well-built, working out every day. A striking character in the bars too, who enjoyed trying to outdrink those he met. He would get outrageously drunk. The next day he would remember little of what he'd done. One of his notable traits was to sing at an incredibly high pitch. Like his mother, he would say. Alcohol and the Leonsky family did not mix well. Indeed, there was much about the Leonskys that few knew about. Eddie was one of 4, 2 brothers and a sister, born to immigrant parents in New Jersey. He was considered the good one.
Eddie Leonski's dad was an alcoholic who regularly beat up not only Eddie, but his other 2 brothers as well. So he would have grown up in that very violent environment. In fact, his mom tried to save herself and her kids from it by getting a divorce. But then what happens? She marries another guy who's just as violent, who beats up Eddie again. So those initial formative years around what his expectations were from parental love and from father figures would have began with that very violent overtone.
Perhaps not surprisingly, given such a tortured family background, Eddie Leonski himself showed 2 distinct personalities.
Interestingly, when Eddie was sober, he was described as a really good soldier and a good guy, very affable and kind. But when he drank, things changed. And when he drank to excess.
He was an obsessive when it came to drinking. He drank just to get drunk.
We're not talking about 5 or 6 beers. We'd say that at any given time he could sit down with 36 beers interspersed with other concoctions with various different other spirits. So he was unable to stop once he started.
And he would make an exhibition of himself. He would do handstands on the bar, I believe, get into fights with people. The next day he would remember nothing.
Leonsky's obsessional drinking reveals much about the state of his mind and about what he had inherited and learned from his father.
If what you see around you is an appropriate way of coping with stress or tiredness or problems is through the use of alcohol. An appropriate way of being able to have fun is only when I'm drunk. An appropriate way of being able to have the confidence to approach a woman is only when I'm intoxicated. Then you learn that. And if you combine that with a predisposition to addiction and alcoholism, then you have a recipe for disaster.
Eddie had been bullied in his native New Jersey when a child and taunted for being a mother's boy. Leonsky's mother was heard by neighbours singing the teenage Leonsky to sleep, perhaps explaining his other obsession, the sound of a woman's voice.
Eddie would have seen this almost continuum from an idealized mother with a soft, sweet voice that would be there to save him, and then a very, very aggressive father that he had to hide from.
Alongside the violence ingrained in his home life, another ingredient was added to the cocktail that made up the mind of the heavy-drinking Eddie Leonski.
All soldiers in wartime are trained to kill. The American GIs with Eddie Leonski were in Australia. They hadn't seen action yet, but they're en route to the South Pacific. Eddie Leonski knew how to kill.
Nobody in Australia or America truly has the full picture of Eddie Leonski as he steps out eventually to meet Ivy McLeod. That he could kill is clear. That he loses control when drunk is obvious to all. That he has a bizarre fetish about women, nobody knows. What will happen when all three factors come together?
May 2 was a Saturday, and it was the night off for the men. Leonsky and his other 15,000 GIs in Camp Pell were sleeping two to a tent. They had to get out, so they went off into the bars and the pubs of the city to go drinking.
They headed for a bar in Beaconsfield Parade near the Melbourne waterfront.
They were drinking whiskey, and it's very likely that Leonsky was drinking for each whiskey a beer chaser.
So, in murky wartime Melbourne, a trained killer who lost control of his actions when drunk, which he was every night, and with a deeply unsettling range of psychiatric issues, was walking the streets. Late autumn was not a good time to be a woman out alone, which Ivy McLeod was, in the Brownout too. As his day had passed, Leonsky, true to form, had become more and more drunk. Witnesses saw him run out of money, borrow some from fellow soldiers, spend it on drink and then go find another bar. He had spotted Ivy as he walked from one of his many bars. As she considered heading home to East Melbourne, she was oblivious to the danger presented by the tortured mind of Private Eddie Leonski. Eddie Leonski spoke to Ivy McLeod sometime between 2:30 and 2:50 a.m. of May 3rd. Hours later, a grim discovery.
Just before light on May the 3rd, a barman at the Bleak House Hotel, where Leonsky had almost certainly been drinking, bent down to pick up something from the floor.
Opposite the hotel, he looked across and thought what he saw was a shop mannequin. Then he saw an American GI walking away, so he went over to the doorway to take a closer look.
It was a dead body, and I think that's where the nightmare that Australians are waking up to really begins. Ivy was found naked, her clothes strewn around everywhere, and was only wearing her belt, presumably because they couldn't get it off or didn't want to.
A barman, Harold Gibson, rang the police from inside the hotel. He picked up 2 bags and covered Ivy's body to protect her modesty. People were beginning to set off for work. He didn't want them to see the body.
So was it Leonsky? He'd been drinking that day and that night, but there was no record at that point of him ever attacking anybody, and it wasn't even really clear that there'd been a murder.
No records of attacks on women in Australia may be, but American GIs had all sorts of backgrounds that the Australian authorities knew nothing about. Leonsky had in fact almost been thrown out of the US Army for assaulting a woman in America. Though naked, an autopsy revealed that Ivy had not been sexually assaulted. Detectives assumed murder, but at first couldn't be certain. As for the American military authorities, on hearing the report of the witness, they simply refused to cooperate. How, in the Brownout, could anybody see what nation's uniform the soldier seen running from the scene was wearing?
It was an absolute mystery. At that point, nobody suspected or even thought of suspecting Eddie Leonski. The first person who went to talk to the police was John Thompson. But in actual fact, the way they made it sound was as if he was a suspect, but he'd been asleep all night and he didn't even know about the murder until his landlady told him the next morning.
The police had found evidence in Ivy's purse to lead them to discover her identity. They released the information, and the man she had spent that Saturday evening with contacted the police to tell them everything he knew. Another witness came forward saying that she had been approached by an American soldier that same evening. He'd asked her to go skating. She had refused, upon which, amazingly, the soldier simply said she was lucky. he'd planned on killing somebody that night. Australian detectives had heard enough to suspect an American soldier was involved in the death of Ivy McLeod. A few days later, medical investigators confirmed that Ivy had indeed been murdered. Her skull had been fractured, probably whilst she was being strangled.
Melbourne had a murder on the loose, and the evidence suggested that it was an American soldier. Now remember, in those days there was no DNA evidence, there were no CCTV cameras, they certainly didn't collect evidence in the forensic way that we did today. And add that to the fact that there were 15,000 American soldiers in the city.
And the American officers in charge were not in a hurry to help the Victoria authorities, which meant that the full story of the murders of the 3 Australians in 1942 has only recently come to light. Court documents, now digitised, tell how Leonsky was allowed to walk freely around Melbourne, even though he had actually confessed to strangling a woman when talking to a fellow GI. Later, some Australians would point to that incident as evidence that some American soldiers simply thought they could get away with murder. Private Anthony Gallo of the 52nd Battalion saw Leonsky drunk outside the tent that they both shared on May 9th. Leonsky said to him, "I killed Gallo, I killed." Gallo already knew Leonsky was capable of violence when drunk.
So Eddie kills, and he's actually very shaken about this because he goes back to his barracks, wakes up a fellow soldier, and confesses and says, "This is what I've done." Gallon doesn't believe him, thinks, okay, go back to sleep. This is ridiculous. But actually, this really had happened, and I think he, to some extent, may have been as surprised about what happened. He must have been coming down from what happened and needed to speak.
Amazingly, he confessed. But if he was the killer, he didn't convince his fellow American GI. Private Gallo heard his confession, but he told nobody.
Meanwhile, in bars and cafes across town, there were murmurings aplenty of where Ivy McLeod's killer had come from. America. And everybody knew what would be happening on a Saturday night in Melbourne. Lots of Americans would be out getting drunk, and lots of Australian girls would be on the town with them, including Pauline Thompson, who told her policeman husband that she was going to a dance at the Music Lovers Club in Melbourne. Pauline, who had 3 children, worked part-time as a receptionist at the Melbourne radio station 3AW and was planning a night out with the girls that she worked alongside. If asked, she would be giving her maiden name, O'Brien.
During times of war, we know that perhaps because death is so close in everyone's mind, that people are much more open to intimacy and human connection. So we know that extramarital affairs soar. And this night, Pauline was looking for that human connection. Her husband was away, and she had arranged to meet up with a GI and just basically just have a good time.
Eddie Leonski was about to confront another woman, alone in Brownout, Melbourne, and he would again be drunk and in search of the sound of a woman's voice. Pauline Thompson was planning on meeting an American GI before going on to a dance club in Melbourne, but he was so late she went on to the Astoria Hotel bar. There, she was seen with an American soldier described as well-built.
Oh, this was classic young woman out on the town stuff. There was singing, there was dancing, there was partying. She loved gin and orange, loved gin and orange. It was wartime. Tensions were high and inhibitions were low.
Pauline and her American GI made an impressive couple as they sampled Melbourne's nightlife. Though she was from Bendigo, a 3-hour train journey north, Pauline lived in a Melbourne apartment house. Pauline Thompson was to die that night, May 9th. Her body was discovered on the steep steps outside of her home the following morning. It was precisely a week since the discovery of the body of Ivy McLeod. She, like Pauline, had been strangled.
The second murder really struck terror into the community. It was revealed that the victim had been seen in the company of an American soldier, and she'd been stripped of her clothes and she'd been strangled.
Did Melbourne have a serial killer on its hands? It appeared that this killer might well be an American.
This really wasn't good for relations between the Americans and the Australians. They'd been trying to build bridges between them. For a little while, the Anzacs were known as the Yanksacks. And then the story breaks.
Police quickly announced that they were keeping an open mind about who the killer might be. They went on record to say that they believed either Mrs. Thompson was throttled by a stranger after she left the soldier to go to her apartment, or by a man whom she may have known, or simply someone waiting in the darkness near to her home. They were sure that she was murdered on the steps outside her front door, but they were sure of little else.
The Americans themselves were not about to go hunting through a camp of 15,000 soldiers with limited evidence, and so were rather reluctant to help the local police.
2 women were dead, but there were no suspects. How would Leonsky have been feeling? What was going on inside the mind of Eddie Leonski? Again, he told his cellmate he had killed. Another confession. But why?
Whether a killer wants to confess or not varies. For some, they confess for narcissistic reasons. For others, they want to confess because it's too big. It's something that they can't control. Yet for others, keeping it secret is a means of control. Not just safety, but control, or even reliving it. I think in this case with Eddie, the confession was probably because he was literally sobering up to what he had done. Literally and metaphorically, he saw in the light of day that he'd taken this young woman's life.
The confession reveals a man at war with himself.
One of the things that he often described was this Jekyll and Hyde character. He saw this in himself. He saw the light and the dark. He saw himself when he was drinking, when he wasn't drinking, when he was violently aroused, when he wasn't.
Leonsky's confession fell on deaf ears. Is there a suspicion of a cover-up?
I don't think it was a cover-up, but I do believe, in retrospect, that if it had been 2 American women who'd been killed, Private Gallo's evidence, Private Gallo's story of the confession would have been passed on and more would have been made of it.
Instead, nothing was done or said, and Leonsky went about his business as usual. The investigating detectives asked for cooperation from their American colleagues in the military police and were allowed to take witnesses to Camp Pell, who watched soldiers march past. They were hoping to see if anybody could be picked out, but nobody recognized anybody who'd been with either woman on the night they were killed.
So Eddie Leonski was basically allowed to go about his business, and for him that just meant getting more and more drunk, day after day, night after night.
Which put Gladys Hosking, a 40-year-old from Perth now living in Melbourne and working at the university's chemistry department, in grave danger one evening in May. Her father had received a letter from her saying she was nervous about walking alone at night in the city and always tried to travel with a companion.
By the 3rd week in May, women were really frightened of going out at night. The local paper, the Melbourne Argus, described it as a panic.
But Gladys, nervous or not, often found herself out at night. Keen on amateur dramatics and ballet dancing, she would regularly scamper across the city to meet up with people. On the 17th of May, a rainy evening, she left work walking with a friend under an umbrella. A short time later, she had dinner somewhere in the area of the Royal Park where Camp Pell was based, and not far from where she lived.
Gladys was seen later still walking under an umbrella. The person holding it was an American GI, and the witness said there was something protective about the way the umbrella was being held.
The witness was Private Malcolm K. Walsh, a military policeman.
It appeared that Gladys was not especially in danger. There had been a couple of murders, but there had been a couple of thousand dates between American soldiers and local women on the same night, and so the MP saw nothing especially to worry about.
Gladys walked away from Private Walsh and into the darkness of the brownout. It was May 17th, 14 days since the murder of Ivy McLeod and 9 days since the discovery of Pauline Thompson's body. Both women had been walking alone in the darkness late at night. Both had been seen in the company of a handsome American soldier. Both were dead. What fate awaited Gladys? Melbourne was experiencing a wet and windy May in 1942, and the arrival of thousands of soldiers to the Royal Park had left the area very muddy. In the early hours of the 18th, Eddie Leonski was stopped by an Australian soldier who was guarding military equipment.
The guard couldn't help but notice that he was covered in mud, head to toe. Then Leonsky asked him for directions back to Camp Pell, Area 1.
He seemed drunk, agitated, almost frantic. He was crying and speaking in an unworldly, high-pitched voice.
The voice he reverted to when he was drunk is telling. Leonsky was a man hugely influenced by an overprotective mother who sang him to sleep to soothe his anxiety in the face of a drunken, violent father. He was obsessed with women's voices, and on that night he was talking to people using a woman's voice.
When he eventually got back to his area, a guard told him to go and wash himself. He was so dirty. He told his tent mate that he'd fallen in mud.
Private Marcel A. Jasinski of Company B of the 52nd Signal Battalion of the US Army was stationed at Camp Pell along with Leonsky. He remembered seeing Leonsky entering the latrine and asking, "Where the hell have you been?" He just looked as if he was in a daze, he told friends. On the other side of the park, a gruesome discovery was about to be made. Gladys Hosking was found dead, strangled with her clothes torn about her in a muddy trench just 350 yards from her home and adjacent to the park. By her body, an umbrella inside of which was the local Melbourne Herald and a copy of that month's Women's Weekly. Her features were almost unrecognisable because of the mud which covered her face. Whoever had killed her also had to be covered in mud.
There was no way that Leonsky could not be connected with Gladys Hosking's murder. He was seen covered in mud, she was found covered in mud. He'd been seen walking the park, her body was found in the park. He was an American soldier and she'd been seen walking with an American soldier.
And when Private Gallo heard the news about the latest murder, there was immediate realization that his tent mate perhaps had not been fooling around when he had said he'd killed women. He reported what he knew to his superiors. They, along with Melbourne detectives, turned all of their resources to Private Eddie Leonski. They searched his tent. Inside, they found a Melbourne newspaper from May 5th, 2 days after Ivy McLeod had been killed. The paper was open on the page that the article about her death was featured. Another newspaper was found, open again, at a story about the death of Pauline Thompson.
Once Leonsky had killed the third time, the case firmed up very, very quickly against him.
As soon as it was put to him that he was a killer, Leonsky put his hands up and said yes. He confessed immediately. It was almost as if it was a relief. And this isn't necessarily the case for many people in this situation. For a lot of people, there's a sense of, I need to hide it, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed, it wasn't me. Nothing like this. Eddie wanted to say what had happened. In fact, he wanted to explain.
Ivy McLeod, Pauline Thompson and Gladys Hosking had indeed been strangled by Leonsky, who had appeared to all of the women as an amiable American before becoming an assassin. The confession and a huge amount of evidence quickly unearthed meant that a conviction was inevitable, but there were still many questions.
Firstly, there was a very important point. Should he be tried in an Australian civil court or should he be tried in an American military court?
And of course, there was this very pressing question about whether or not Leonsky was sane and he could be tried as a sane person.
The system was in uncharted territory. The politicians wanted the case tried in local civil courts, but this was a soldier under the jurisdiction of a foreign power, albeit an ally.
General MacArthur himself, leader of the Joint Services Command in the South Pacific, became involved. There was a real threat that anti-American feelings could get out of hand. He wanted Leonsky tried by Americans, convicted by Americans, and almost certainly executed by Americans. The Australian authorities gave way, still the only time a killer on Australian soil has not been tried by an Australian court. It's not possible to consider this case without also considering world events. At this point, Ivy, Pauline and Gladys are part of a bigger story. Melbourne, part of a theatre of war. Leonsky is a man few want to hang around. Is the Brownout killer expendable?
This was a problem that MacArthur just didn't need. The push against the Japanese had begun. Air raids were planned against Timor, about 600 miles north of Darwin. Anzacs and Americans were fighting side by side as the push against Burma was being planned. It was clear that this is something MacArthur just did not need.
Leonsky had one chance. A young counsel who would go on to be a major figure in United States legal and political circles was appointed to defend Leonsky. Ira C. Rothgerber would go on to distinguish himself as a tough Denver lawyer and to work for President John F. Kennedy. He was no shrinking violet.
This was this young man's first major defence case, and the person he was defending was facing the death penalty. It wasn't going to be a speedy trial. He was going to take his time, and he was going to be tenacious.
Because of this question of his sanity, Leonsky is seen by a psychiatrist in Melbourne, who actually goes on to say that he found him very friendly and actually in quite a good mood. Didn't in fact think he had any issues around sanity, that he was very sane, and in fact made the point that it was only when his mother was mentioned that he began to seem agitated, as if the biggest issue for Eddie was that his mom didn't find out he'd done something bad. That was the most important thing for him, which then begs the question, if he was being seen by a psychiatrist today, would the same questions have been asked? Psychiatry and psychology have evolved since then. We know more. And one has to wonder if there would have been more of a case made about his ability to take full responsibility over his actions.
Rothgerber probed and pushed for evidence of insanity and instability. Why would Leonsky get so drunk and lace alcoholic concoctions with such bizarre ingredients? Whiskey and beer with tomato ketchup, milk, mustard and gin. Why would he sing in a woman's voice? Why would he talk in general conversation using a woman's voice? And why would he always give the same reason for killing his victims?
So when he goes on to explain what happened, for example, with the first victim who was found with the belt, he makes a point of saying, I couldn't get the belt off. Just so you understand, it was her voice I wanted to take. And this happens with each and every victim. He goes on to explain that it was this voice, this softness that he wanted somehow to have, this thing that he kept emulating himself, soothing himself with these voices.
Would the court-martial agree that Leonsky was insane? If it did, it would mean Leonsky would not face the death penalty.
Now, Rothgerber felt very passionately that he shouldn't be held completely accountable, that his faculties were in fact compromised. And he refers to the psychiatrist's report and says, look, yes, you've said that he's a psychopath, but also you've made the point that it was because of the alcoholism, that if given the same situations, he could do this again. And if that's the case, can he in fact be held accountable? And he actually campaigns very, very strongly in the hopes that that this soldier won't meet the fate that was in front of him, which was the death penalty.
That expert conclusion was followed by two more, and all three concurred. They decided he was bad, not mad, and if allowed, he would do it again.
After the 4-day trial, the members of the court-martial required only 40 minutes to reach a verdict. Leonsky was ordered to stand before the president's table. He turned to Ira Rothgerber and asked if he could hold his hand. The pair stood, holding hands.
1 out of 4 of all of the jurors believed that he was in fact insane.
If the court were to split down the middle, Leonsky might escape the death penalty.
Nobody from the families of the murdered women was present at the court-martial. Such niceties were not observed in wartime. The president told him, "Leonsky, it's my duty to inform you that this court, in closed session and upon secret ballot, with 3/4 of the members present concurring, found you guilty of all charges. I have to inform you also that this court, with all of its members concurring, sentences you to be hanged by the neck until you are dead."
Leonsky gave nothing away, emotionless.
The indefatigable Rothgerber petitioned for clemency. He called on President Roosevelt to commute the sentence to life in prison. Ivy, Pauline and Gladys had been killed, 3 innocents, but what was the point of executing a man with considerable and very damaging issues? Would his plea work?
This was a traumatic, life-changing moment for Rothgerber. He was a young, committed lawyer. It was his first defence, and the man he was defending could face hanging.
News of the verdict was greeted positively in the Australian press. The question of whether Leonsky would live or die would not be one answered by America's president.
He said this was a military matter, and it was something for General MacArthur to handle. The timing for Leonsky couldn't have been worse. A few weeks after the trial, Americans and Australian soldiers get involved in a firefight in Brisbane in a bar. Couldn't have been worse, the timing. An Australian was killed, and there we go. The relationship issue had reared its ugly head again.
General MacArthur never admitted it, but he wanted the story to end. He was determined to stamp down on anything that might drive a wedge between the Australians and the Americans.
Leonsky, the serial killer, would not have his life spared. MacArthur was in no mood to do anything other than serve military priorities.
So in the end, Eddie Leonski, abused child, damaged man, killer, is sacrificed for American-Australian relations.
These are the men who are defending the aerial approaches to Australia. And here's real action. Jap plane spotted. In a matter of seconds, the anti-aircraft crews are letting them have it.
Leonsky was moved to Melbourne's Pentridge prison on November 9th, 1942. He said so long to his jailer, joking that he was going for a facelift and was hanged. But that was not the end of the story.
The terrible deaths of Ivy, Pauline and Gladys would end up changing American law forever. In 1951, the extraordinary work of Ira Rothgerber ended up creating the Uniform Code of Military Justice, law which is still in use today.
Eddie Leonski was executed within 12 weeks of being sentenced and found guilty. He had carried out his series of killings in just 3 weeks. The deaths of Ivy, Pauline and Gladys at the hands of Eddie Leonski could have been prevented if he hadn't been allowed into Australia in the first place. He had already attacked a woman in the United States. Ivy's tragedy was to be 15 minutes early for her late tram ride home. Pauline, looking forward to her new life in New South Wales, had been warned by her estranged husband not to go out with GIs. She didn't listen. And Gladys had even told her father how she was afraid of venturing out into Melbourne after dark. But she still did. She too was to become a victim of the Brownout Strangler, Eddie Leonski.